Good afternoon, everybody. Let's continue with the nervous system discussion of what we have already discussed as far as the nervous system, pretty much the basics of the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system as far as neurons and neuroglia and how neurons work. Today we get into more of the gross anatomy, if you will, talking about the brain, and that is pretty much what's on slate for this lecture is the brain. I will most likely give you a little bit of spinal cord discussion, but I know that it's going to be mostly dedicated to the brain today. So let me share the screen so you see what I'm seeing. All right. Let me clear room for our make room for our lecture tonight. Great. And we're going to go to the brain in chapter 23 in the Salvo book. All right. That was where we left off, the synapse. All right. If you remember that the central nervous system, what just happened? The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and just those two things, and anything that's brain related or spinal cord related, including the covering that surrounds them called the meninges. And I always wish that they would start, in the book with the meninges, but for the most part, you get your discussion of brain and spinal cord and then meninges. But the meninges are completely encasing the brain and the spinal cord. In fact, the meninges continues through the entire spinal canal. And even though the spinal cord ends roughly at the level of lumbar 1, lumbar 2, in other words, it was right in between the first and second vertebrae of the lower 5, that's where the spinal cord comes to an end. And there's a continuation of paired spinal nerves that we still find in the canal called the horse's tail in English, or the cauda equina in Latin. Well, I'll just refer to it as the horse's tail for now because it looks like a horse's tail. That's all in the spinal canal, continuing from the L2 space all the way down through the sacrum, and with the final pair exiting just above the coccyx. Those are bones of the spinal column. The vertebrae are all individually movable upon the next segment, but down at the bottom of the spinal column, one bone of 5 segments that fuses into one, what's called the sacrum, it's going to connect to the pelvis at what we call the sacroiliac joint. The sacrum is the bone, the ilium is part of the pelvis, and where they connect, we don't want 5 individual segments connected to the pelvis, so they fuse into one solid segment so that we're more stabilized. And there are nerves that are exiting from the holes in the sacrum. They're exiting in pairs, and at the very end of the sacrum there's a little piece called the coccyx, and there's a paired nerve that comes out above that. So the meninges that surround the brain and the spinal cord, even though the spinal cord ends between L1 and L2, the meninges continue all the way down through the end of the spinal canal. So like I said, I always wish that the meninges were covered first, but they typically are not. Oh, wait a minute. Look what I did. I moved it. I'm pretty sure I moved it because I don't remember that being. Oh, maybe I'm thinking of my other textbook. Let's see. Yeah, I didn't move it. It was good. It is first. Fantastic. I get to talk about the meninges because it's kind of almost like we're going from the outside in. If you start and talk about the brain and all its parts, and then all of a sudden you're talking about the meninges, well, I feel like it's out of place. So good for me, good for Salvo. Let's get the meninges discussed. All right. So first and foremost, the meninges are discussed in 3 parts. There's the outermost meningeal layer, which is what I like to call a 2-ply layer. There's the middle layer, which is very hazy looking, and the original observers thought it looked like spider webbing, so they called it spider mother. Well, I'll explain the whole mother thing. And then the innermost, which is a thin, delicate almost transparent lining is called pia mater. So you've got this outer tough dura mater, this middle arachnoid mater, and pia mater. First of all, mater is in the Latin mother, as in maternal, as in maternity. You may have known schools, Mater Dei out in the Highland area of Illinois, for those of you that are over there. Mater Dei is the name of the school that's out there. Anyway, mater means mother. And the reason why mater is used for the meninges is because it appears like the brain and spinal cord are completely encased within their own womb. That's W-O-M-B, womb. Okay, the womb. And we know the womb to be a maternal thing, not a paternal thing. So, so the original observers refer to this as the tough part of the womb, the spider-like part of the womb, and the thin, or if you will, the delicate, the soft part of the womb. And those are the words, dura as in durable, right? If something's durable, it's very tough, it's dense. Arachnoid, for those that have heard of arachnophobia, that's a fear of spiders. And pia is a Latin word meaning soft. So you've got the tough dura mater, the spider-like arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Now, the benefit of the tough outer dura mater is protection. It's very dense. It is, again, 2-ply. There are points at which the 2-ply of it splits, so where it looks like that, and then they form their own channel, and it allows blood flow from the venous return of the blood vessels of the brain to use those channels as an extra means of getting blood out of the brain. So that's what we call the dural sinuses. They're actually splits in the layers of the dura mater. The arachnoid mater is hazy and spiderweb looking because it's full of almost these little fascial spicules that are essentially holding the blood vessels against the brain's lining. And it's also where we find cerebral spinal fluid filling the space and being moved by the cilia of the linings, the ependema that lines the ventricles that stores the cerebral spinal fluid. So once the cerebral spinal fluid is in circulation, it's in circulation on the lower part of the meningeal layer, what we call the subarachnoid space. So it goes dura mater, then arachnoid mater, and then in the lower space of the arachnoid mater is cerebral spinal fluid. And then we see a very delicate, thin lining of pia mater, which is directly adherent to the actual neurons, or if you will, ependema, or even the neuroglia that may be adjacent to that thin layer of connective tissue that's called the pia mater. So this is the typical picture on the right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in for you. Let me zoom in. All right, and this is your typical picture of meninges, and I've come to find that it's not the greatest example because, one, you really can't see the arachnoid mater well. I don't know if you see the little white spicules in there. Maybe if you've got your book open, it's easier to see, but this is supposed to be the bone of the skull. This is the outer ply of the dura mater, the inner ply of the dura mater, okay? Then the arachnoid mater, there's like a basement membrane, and then the spicules, and then the very soft pia mater. If they show it from the outside, this is the brain, okay? This is part of the brain. This is all part of the brain. Everything inside the skull is brain. And we see this fluid-filled space. That's supposed to be cerebral spinal fluid, which means the dura mater would be on the bone side of that, and the arachnoid mater would be on the brain side of that. These are not the greatest images of meninges, and me personally, I don't feel like they do justice to the meninges. So, you may have heard of meningitis. That is an inflammation or an infection of the meningeal layers, not the actual brain itself. Look, I don't want any infection, but I'd rather have a meningitis than an encephalitis because I don't want my brain to be infected. Not saying that meningitis can't be bad. It can't cause fever that can lead to seizures and kill you, but I'd still rather, if given me the option of meningitis or encephalitis, which means inside the head infection, which is your brain, I'll take the meningitis. But let me show you meninges from a different perspective. Let me show you meninges from El Interneto. Okay, the internet. I think that's how they say it in Spanish. I don't know. I think I heard that on a TV show once. All right. So meninges anatomy. So the first one I'm going to show you is right here. This is kind of a zoomed in on the top of the skull. Okay, so we see the skin. And if you look at the base of the skin, we see this little lining on the underside of the skin, which is probably supposed to be the periosteum of connective tissue that surrounds the bone. Then there's the cranial bone. And then immediately underneath the cranial bone is the first layer of dura mater and then the second layer of dura mater. And notice that they're split. And where they are split here, there's a little perforation of this arachnoid mater coming through those. And you see another perforation there. We call these the arachnoid granulations. And what they are since the cerebrospinal fluid is in here, where all those spicules are, that's full of cerebrospinal fluid. So this allows cerebrospinal fluid to come up into the dural sinus where blood from the veins is coming in, and it essentially sifts off the cerebrospinal fluid and returns it with the venous return back directionally toward the heart. So these arachnoid granulations perforating through the dura mater are a way to essentially flush out old cerebrospinal fluid to make room for new cerebrospinal fluid. But you see these little spicules, these little tiny connection points between the basement membrane of the arachnoid mater and then the pia mater, which is this whitish layer right here. Again, if you ever see blood vessels, the blood vessels are held in place by the forest of arachnoid mater. Typically, when you see pictures of the brain, if you don't see any blood vessels on the brain, that's because the dura mater and the arachnoid mater have been removed. If you do see blood vessels on the brain, it often looks hazy, not very clear to look directly at the surface of the brain. And that's because the arachnoid mater creates that haziness with all these little spicules. If the dura mater is still covering the brain, you don't appreciate any of the brain. You see the shape, you see what look like blood vessels that are actually embedded in the dura mater, but you don't see any of the folds or creases or anything like that that's typical of looking at a brain, because the dura mater is shiny and gray and almost silvery gray, and it's very dense. It doesn't tear easily, it doesn't stretch very well. It almost looks like a shower cap, a real tight, it almost like what if you look at the Olympics with the swimmers that wear their hats, their little swim caps, it almost looks like a tight little swim cap covering the brain and strapped around the spinal cord. So this is one example of the three layers: the two ply of dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and then the very thin, transparent pia mater. And then this pinkish looking stuff, that's what's called the cerebral cortex. The word cortex is used whenever we're describing the outer shell of an organ. So it's the outer shell of the brain. And the reason why it has that darker color is because it is neuron cell bodies. And many of those neuron cell bodies don't even have axons. They're anaxonal, which means they're without axons. They only have cell bodies that connect through their dendrites to other cell bodies. And they're typically part of a network of neurons that are responsible for memory, mood, behavior, analytical thought processes, sensory interpretation. It depends on which part of the brain it's in. But it's a darker looking area because there's no myelin. But as you get more to the core and we see these wider zones, those are going to be the myelinated tracts that are leaving and entering into those parts of the brain. If it's the backside of the brain, those tracts are entering, coming in because they're sensory. And if it's the front side of the brain, those tracts are motor, so they would be going out. So let's take a look at a few other examples of meninges until I show you my favorite example of meninges. Not a great one, in my opinion. Don't even know what that is, why they're showing it like that. That's some brain anatomy, but not necessarily meningeal. This is a classic meninges pattern. If we zoom in on it just a little bit, we see again the skin of the skull, the scalp, if you will, remove the skin and some underlying blood vessels on the periosteum, which is the connective tissue blanket of the skull, right? They've got it here as epicranium, which is periosteum. Then they have the calvaria, which is the bone of the skull. All right, these just words that you don't hear very often, so don't worry about it. I mean, like you hear this Galea aponeurotica, that's just the aponeurosis, the tissue that's between the muscle that makes your eyebrows raise and wrinkle your forehead and the muscle toward the back. It's called occipitofrontalis, and the Galea is a sheath that connects these two muscles across the top of the head. Again, the epicranium is periosteum. The calvaria is the spongy bone of the cranium there, and then you get immediately underneath the bone, and then we see the two ply of dura mater. Here's where, if you follow the hand on the cursor, here's where they're together. Here's where they split apart to form what's called a sinus, a dural sinus. This one that's right down the middle is called the superior sagittal sinus because it's on top and it runs from front to back like the sagittal plane does. Sagittal is where the word Sagittarius comes from, which means the archer, because sagitt is the arrow and it's the direction of the arrow. So sagittal. And we use it to describe our midline, sagittal, mid, sagittal especially. And so there's not only a suture between the two bones called the parietal bones, it's called the sagittal suture, but the sinus that's underneath that suture, created by the dura splitting apart, is called the sagittal sinus. There's some other smaller sinuses that are on the top end, which is what superior means. But for the most part, that sagittal sinus is the largest one. It's a very big sinus. And you can look at this view of the what we call a frontal slice of the skull. And when we see this frontal slice, we can see the white of the brain, which are, again, the myelinated tracts. We can go out to the cortex. Again, it won't be as white. It'll be a more pinkish, peachish color with just cell bodies. But it allows you to see just how many blood vessels surround this brain. Everywhere we see a crease or a fold, you're going to find blood vessels. And notice that they're contained by this forest of arachnoid mater. All right, so the dura mater, what we see here, is splitting to form this sinus, splitting again to form that sinus, splitting to form a sinus over here. But you can see the two layers, the outer layer, which is often called the parietal layer, because parietal means the wall. And then the inner layer is usually called the visceral layer, because viscera are your organs. So the part facing the parietum or the wall, the part facing the organ, and that's how it's broken down. But inner and outer is just fine. Again, it's the split in those two layers that creates these sinuses. And notice the way these blue vessels are channeling into the sinus. This is because the blue vessels, called veins, are bringing blood out of the brain into the sinus, and then the sinus comes around and then dumps the blood into what's called the jugular veins, and that allows the blood to go back to the heart. The red vessels that you see here, these are blood vessels called arteries, and arteries are bringing blood from the heart to the brain. Here is an example of a chamber known as a ventricle. It's an open space in the brain, and there's cerebrospinal fluid stored in there, and it would travel through what are called aqueducts, these little if you will, pipes that allow the stored cerebrospinal fluid to start circulating through the arachnoid mater and around the surface of the brain and spinal cord. So when we zoom up at the top, again, we see the two ply of the dura mater, that pinkish jungle of arachnoid mater, the spider webbing, and then the very thin lining known as the pia mater. It's a very soft, delicate lining, if you will. If you only saw the brain with pia mater, there'd be a shine from light that's reflecting off of the transparency of the pia mater, but you wouldn't see any blood vessels, arachnoid mater or dura mater, if you're looking at that part of the brain. Let's see some others. Again, the cerebrospinal fluid around the surface of the brain and spinal cord. Not my favorite example of meninges by any means, but they're trying to show you the thick dura mater, the spider webbing of arachnoid mater, and the very thin pia mater. Again, here's the split between the outer and middle inner layer of dura mater, creating the sinus. We see the arachnoid mater is supposed to be this yellowish stuff that's perforating into the dura. And then we've got this very thin lined yellow pia mater. Again, they're zoomed in. We can see the gray matter of the brain. We can see the white matter of the brain. Again, the white matter is all tracts of myelinated axons. The gray matter is all cell bodies of neurons. We see the bluish of the spider webbing of arachnoid mater holding all those blood vessels in place. And we see the dense dura mater. Again, it's together here, but here's the split to form a sinus. Notice that the brain has these little channels, this little groove here, groove there, groove there, groove there. Again, this is a frontal slice, so it's not as, I mean, it's easy to see, but it's typically not the way we talk about what are called the gyri and the sulci of the brain. A gyrus is this protruded part, and a sulcus is the part that's folded in on itself, the crease, what's sulking in. So this would be considered a sulcus between this gyrus and that gyrus. This would be a sulcus between this gyrus and that gyrus. This is a sulcus, again, between this gyrus and that gyrus, et cetera, et cetera. So when you typically see the brain, you see gyri and sulci. The dura mater will actually follow in to the sulcus, right? Into the fissures that separate the left and right hemisphere. But all we see in the lining of the sulci are the pia mater and not even the arachnoid mater. So again, here's skin, here's muscle, here's bone, here's, and that could be periosteum versus muscle. It just depends on where we are in the skull. But there's bone, there's outer layer meninges that we see there. Here's inner layer meninges that we see there. Here's their split into what creates the sinus. The blue of the arachnoid mater, all those little spicules of spider webbing holding the blood vessels in place, perforating into the sinuses to sift off cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid, again, is in this space where the blood vessels are, and is referred to as the subarachnoid space, and then the very soft, delicate pia mater. All right. Oh, that's a pretty good, if we zoom in, or if you look here at the way the spider webbing of arachnoid mater appears relative to the very thin pia mater and the dense 2-ply of dura mater. So that's a good example of how the blood vessels are so contained, so, if you will, strapped to the brain, the surface of the brain, because it's within that forest of arachnoid mater. All right. So now let me show you my favorite version. Ooh, hemorrhaging, bleeding. Hemorrhage means excessive blood. Heme is blood. Anytime you see the RRHAGE or RRIA, RIA, it means excessive flow of. So excessive flow of blood loss. In this particular picture, we see blood pushing against the dura mater between the bone and the dura. That's called an epidural hematoma. Here's an injury between the dura and the arachnoid called a subdural hematoma. Here's one that's between the arachnoid and the pia, that'd be subarachnoid. And then here's a bleed directly on the brain itself, and that's your intracranial hemorrhage, your intracranial bleed. Intracerebral, intracranial, same thing. This view of again, it's a frontal slice. It allows you not only to appreciate the sulcus, right, of the cerebrum, which is what I like to call the smart brain, but it also shows you the different gyri and sulci of the cerebellum, which is used for balance and posture and things of that sort. So again, we see the meninges here in the green and the yellow, then the blue, and then the pink. And notice the way the blood vessels are within the creases of the sulci around the brain, going over gyri, etc. All right, so let's show you real pictures. Oh, that's a pretty decent one, actually. Again, we see the bone of the skull. We see the 2-ply of the dura. We see the arachnoid perforating into the dura at the sinus. All those little spicules of subarachnoid space where the cerebrospinal fluid is, and pia mater. All right, so I'm going to show you now real pictures, real views of these things. So let me show you first Dura Mater on a cadaver. See, I've done it before, haven't I? It's already popped up there in blue. That's my favorite one right there. I'm going to show you that, but I want to show you this one first. On this particular picture, if you look at the forceps have the Dura Mater reflected back so we can see the surface of the brain. And look at all the blood vessels on the brain. Now, in some places, like our arms and our legs, there are twice as many blue veins as there are red arteries. And when we get to that section of arteries and veins, I'm going to tell you they're not red and blue anyway. But for now, the red vessels are the arteries and the blue vessels are the veins. And notice that when you look here, even though the veins look a little bit bigger, only because they're more to the periphery, they're about equal in number in the brain. But in the arms and legs, there's twice as many veins as there are arteries. In the abdomen, there's almost 4 times as many veins than there are arteries. And it all has to do with the nature of how arteries and veins are different from each other, and under pressure with arteries, not under pressure with veins. And so you need more avenue of return back to the heart when it's venous return. Before I go back to this one, and again, this is my absolute favorite way of showing the meninges. I want to give you a better idea of the Dura Mater. Okay, so this one, the little bit of Dura Mater we see on this picture is only here at the top. But then when you look at the rest of the brain, does everybody see that there's this hazy, almost like a film over the brain that looks hazy, and we see blood vessels? That's arachnoid mater. If you were to remove the arachnoid mater, the blood vessels are going to probably go with it, and then we'd see your typical shiny pia mater on the brain. That's on the spinal cord. There. This is a sheep's brain, if I'm not mistaken, and we see the scientist or whoever's doing the dissection of it reflecting back the Dura Mater off of this brain. If you look down at the bottom right, on this cadaver picture, there's Dura Mater over the cerebrum here, Dura Mater over the cerebellum there. This is the dural sinus. This is the sagittal one. This one's called the transverse sinus because it goes across rather than down the middle. Anyway, this left side of the cerebrum has arachnoid mater, the left side of the cerebellum has arachnoid mater on it. But all they did was they removed the Dura Mater from the left side of the brain, but they left it on the right side of the brain. Just to let you know, this little bit of tissue that's here in the middle is referred to as the falx. There's not only falx, but then there's this called a tentorium. Both are basically connective tissue separators of the parts of the brain. They act like partitions. Falx, if I'm not mistaken, is like that of a sickle. And then tentorium is basically a tent, like a covering. So when we look at this picture, that's completely covered in Dura Mater. All right, this gray, silverish, dense covering. Let me find some good ones for you, where we can really appreciate just the Dura. This is supposed to be an illustration of it. But you can see how they reflected the Dura Mater back, and you can look down and then see the part of the brain. When Dura Mater is on there, it's just gray, and you don't really see much of the contours of the brain. What they did was they reflected a little bit back here so you can see the sinus, sagittal sinus, and a little bit here so you can see some of the gyri and the sulci. Again, there's your falx, and there's your tentorium. The brain is not jumping around. As the Dura Mater becomes the falx, it acts like a partition so that the brain is still in 2 parts, but it's not as if it's bouncing around and moving around. The falx really does a good job containing. This is actually this is Dura Mater. If you look here, they removed the brain, but they left the Dura Mater adherent to the skull. This is the lower part of the skull. There's the spinal cord right there. And that's actually the inner Dura Mater. There's your optic nerve in your eyeball. This is the going to give off the olfactory bulb for smell. By the way, that was dura mater here on the outside around the spinal cord, and that's your horse's tail, everybody. The horse's tail I was talking about earlier. Cauda equina, the tail of the horse. Let's get out of that. Because the first time you see dura mater and go, okay, I get it. You won't ever not think something else is dura mater. This is dura mater right here where the hand is. Okay. But on this right side of the brain, they've removed it so that we can see the contours of the brain, all the blood vessels, and look at all that hazy spider webbing that covers it. That's your arachnoid mater. Right. So dura mater is on the outside, arachnoid mater is the next layer. Again, the spinal cord and its horse's tail with the dura mater sliced open so you can see something. And there's one particular picture where it's just so shiny and silvery. That's why I'm looking for it, so I can show you. Just to give you an idea, there's no dura mater on this picture. We see the haziness of the arachnoid mater, and then when they remove it, all we have is the pia mater against the delicate borders of this gyrus, that gyrus, that gyrus, and that's a sulcus, 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 sulcus. So where is my silvery dura mater? There, it's this is a picture of it, but there's an actual cadaver thing of it too. You see the silvery gray stuff? That's your dura mater. And what this particular picture is doing is showing you the dura mater, that's its outer ply and its inner ply, the arachnoid mater a little more hazy, and then the pia mater. But look at how free bordered the sulcus are now, each sulcus, because again, the pia mater is going to tuck into it, not stay over the top of it. All right, now we go back to my favorite picture of meninges. Right at the beginning. And let me explain to you what we're looking at here. We are looking at the top of somebody's head. These are the ears. The eyebrows be down a little lower, faces to the front here at the top. The back of the head is down here where it says Science Photo Library. What the dissecting team did with this cadaver, and if you notice, you've got about the same distance from the skin here to that as there is from here to there, from here to there. It's as if they took 1-inch strips and removed 1 inch at a time. So if we were to take this skull and this face, this head, and turn it sideways, it would look like it's stair stepping down from the left side to the right side. You have the skin and then 1 inch, and then it looks like it's getting deeper, 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 almost like a stair step. Okay. So let me explain to you what you've got here. This is skin to the far left. Then we have what's called the epicranius muscle, also known as the occipitofrontalis muscle. If we were to zoom in, in fact, let's do that. Let me open this image as its own tab so I can zoom in on it for you. Okay, so if we look in right here, we see some muscle. That's muscle fiber. And then it becomes this dense sheath, and toward the back there'd be muscle again. This is the occipitalis portion. This is the frontalis portion. This is the glia aponeurotica, the sheath of connective tissue between the frontalis and the occipitalis. Glia itself describes a helmet. So it's the helmet aponeurosis. And aponeurosis as a structure anatomically will connect muscle to bone. But instead of being cord-like and elastic like a typical tendon, the aponeurosis is sheath-like. So it's flat and it's like a sheath, and it's not very stretchy. In fact, it's missing the elasticity that allows it to be stretchy. So it's a dense sheath, but it does a good job of connecting larger area of muscle to bone. So on this particular specimen, you've got the skin, and then they removed a layer of skin so that all we can see is the frontalis muscle, the aponeurotica here, the aponeurosis is another way of saying it. And then if we were to get far enough back, we'd see the occipitalis portion of that. Then they removed another strip. They removed the frontalis and the glia, and now what we see is a type of tissue called periosteum. If you remember our lecture last time with the nerve, we had an endoneurium, a perineurium, and a connective tissue layer called the epineurium. Well, neurium is to the nerve what osteum is to bone, and surrounding bone is a connective tissue blanket, the life support system of the bone, if you will, called periosteum. This is periosteum right here, all the way over the top. Then they removed that inch or so of periosteum so that all we can see is bone. And if you look really closely, let's zoom in on it. That didn't work. Why not? It's not getting any smaller. Let's see. What did I do? Okay, am I not on here? Yeah, I am. There we go. If you look really closely, you see the little ziggle, 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 quiggle, squiggle, squiggle. That is called the suture. And that's because this bone right here is the frontal bone, and this bone right here is the left parietal bone. And if you look really close, you can see a little bit of suture line here because this is part left parietal bone, and the right parietal bone, part of it's still there, sutured with it, but the rest has been removed because the next inch is removing that bone. And now we see dura mater. That's all dura mater. Every bit of that is dura mater. This whole little strip right here, dura, tough, dense. Then they removed another inch, and look at the haziness, the grayish, reddish haziness of the arachnoid mater. And then they removed another inch, and now we can see the gyri and the sulci of the brain completely covered in a thin, soft pia mater. So again, from the side, it's stair-stepping. One next, it's just getting deeper, deeper, deeper. But they did a good job of stripping, and then 2 layers, then 3 layers, and 4 layers, right? Because right here, all they had to do was remove skin. But right here, they had to remove frontalis and aponeurosis. Here, they had to remove those plus the periosteum. Here, they had to remove all those plus the bone. Here, they had to remove all of that plus the dura mater. And here, everything's removed except pia mater and cerebrum, the brain. So that is an incredible example of being able to see the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater to the right half of this brain. We still see the skull bone, the periosteum that covers the skull bone, and the muscle that moves the skin. If you raise your eyebrows and wrinkle your forehead, that is your frontalis muscle contracting. It's a muscle that moves skin and fascia, not a muscle moving bone to bone like typical muscles do. So those are dura mater pictures. If I get rid of the word cadaver, I'm curious if I get any of the gray, or if it gets to be a lot of what we saw before. This is a popular picture of dura mater from Ken Hub. And again, there's the outer dura and the inner dura. That's the sinus. No, just a little bit. We saw that picture already. There, that's dura. That's what I wanted to show earlier. This is dura mater completely covering that brain, right? So notice that we really can't appreciate any of the gyri or the sulci of the brain. We see arteries of the meninges, but we don't see anything on the brain itself. And notice that there's like an edge line of dura that they've got drawn here. And that's how they cut it so that they can remove that in the brain. So that's good picture of a good example of dura mater. And if we looked at it on the spinal cord, the green part would be the dura mater. The orange part would be the arachnoid mater, and the thin pink red part is pia mater. And notice that we really don't appreciate much of the nerve when dura mater is there. They've shadowed what's underneath it, but you can appreciate all of the little roots of the nerve connected in the spinal cord when all you're looking is pia mater. Like the brain, the spinal cord has blood vessels on it. That way the neurons can get blood supply. The brain is full of blood vessels. All right. So those are meninges. Let's see if there's anything else that jumps out. Let's change that from dura mater to arachnoid mater. And see if we see any real hazy. We already looked at that one. And here's zoomed in on the arachnoid. That's what makes it hazy. These what are called arachnoid granules. Well, I refer to them typically as spicules. And this is a good picture of a brain with arachnoid still on it. The middle meninges. It's like saying phalanx instead of phalanges. Meninges. It's webby-like, which is why, and to give you an idea of the spider webbing, I don't want you to think brilliant orb weaver type beautiful spider web. I want you to think more of the hazy cobwebby stuff you find in an attic, at least in the movies. That's the story of the arachnoid mater. That's a pretty intense chart, intense chart. And lastly, let's take a look at the pia mater, which again will look just like a shiny, almost like a cellophane wrapping of the brain and spinal cord. When you look at this brain, arachnoid this is incorrect. It's arachnoid on the left. Somebody messed up. It's pia on the right. Okay. You can tell the blood vessels are gone. It's not hazy looking. Pia mater exists on the right. And pia mater does fold in the sulci. Pia mater is the innermost. Let's see if this one's better illustrated. Pia mater on the left, arachnoid mater on the right. Let's see if they're correct. Yeah. Arachnoid mater on the left, pia mater on the right. And again, if it was the spinal cord, pia mater innermost layer directly adherent to the surface of the brain. That's a good picture. This is a great picture of just both sides of the brain. We see gyrus upon gyrus upon gyrus, sulcus upon sulcus upon sulcus. Those are the meninges. Now, I do want to mention something about cerebrospinal fluid. CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid, is what bathes the outer surface of the brain and spinal cord. Notice when we look at this picture, and I showed you this one before, there are these arrows. It all starts right here around the area of what's known as the thalamus. You have these two chambers on either side of the cerebrum, with the thalamus sitting in the middle. These chambers, or they're called cerebral ventricles. Okay, you see the word ventricle right down here. There's this ventricle right here. Okay, and then there's this one back here. These are called the lateral ventricles. There's a small bridge between them that's intraventricular that opens up. Now, what's important about this is that there are these very specialized blood vessels right here. They're referred to as the choroid plexus. You will never have to know choroid plexus, but they are lined. You know, the ventricles there are lined with the ependema, and the blood vessels are essentially a weave of knotted capillaries. And what makes them special, this grouping or plexus of choroid, is that the plasma of the blood can easily trickle through the gaps of these types of arterioles and capillaries, but not the big stuff with the blood. So essentially, the only thing that's leaking out of these choroid plexus is water, sugar, very small molecular structures of small protein or whatever, but and some salt, a little bit of salt, saline. It's essentially a saline type removal of the plasma. And the choroid plexus has cilia, and the lining of the ependymma has cilia. So as blood comes into the choroid plexus and the secretion of CSF comes from it, it starts to collect in these reservoirs of the lateral ventricles. Well, once the cilia start waving, the CSF moves through a chamber, a zone called an aqueduct, and it will surround the back part of the brainstem, get swept around the cerebellum. It's actually pushed into the spinal canal, where it basically moves around the subarachnoid space of the spinal cord until the front side cilia pushes it back up, and it eventually goes around the front of the brain and starts sifting off at the top of the skull. It's cerebral spinal fluid made here at the top of the you've got this is one of the chambers right here, this pinkish peach thing, and the cilia, and again it drives it into the space. You can see the arrows, and by the way, this is a more dimensional thing. This is the left lateral ventricle. This is referred to as the third ventricle, and then the fourth ventricle is right here. You won't ever need to know the ventricles, but if you saw them in 3D, it might make a little more sense. Again, the squiggle of red here, where it's all starting 1, 2, and 3, that's where cerebral spinal fluid is being created. A little extra cerebral spinal fluid down where it says 5, but it moves down, around, up around the front, and then sifts off. So you can see the numbering system: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and cleared out into the sagittal sinus. So it is used a little bit for shock absorption, because you do have basically a lazy river of cerebral spinal fluid around the brain, but it's also a source of nutrition for the neurons of the periphery of the brain. And that's the whole reason the ependymma exists, so that it can absorb CSF nutrition and get it over to neurons. So again, this is more of a three-dimensional view of the ventricles. Let me show you these cerebral ventricles. And since we're not dissecting anything, you're not going to have to worry about cerebral ventricles. I just want to give you an idea. That's what they would look like if it was just the chambers. Okay, just the chambers. You've got, this is the left lateral ventricle, the right one's on the other side. This is the third ventricle, that's the fourth ventricle. And these are just open spaces in the brain. Okay. So as the brain creates these chambers, cerebral spinal fluid is what we find in here. Three-dimensional ventricles of the brain. Here's the front view of those ventricles. There's the side view, there's the front view. Here's an actual brain with arachnoid mater still on it, at least one hemisphere of the brain, right? We're looking at the left hemisphere from the right side. And if you look at this open hole, this open space, that is the ventricle. There's another one here, and another one there, and the last one there. So if all we did was fill the space with blue plastic, it would look like that. Or green plastic in this case. That's cerebrospinal fluid traveling, or those are the reservoirs, if you will, of cerebrospinal fluid. All right. So, fun stuff so far? Maybe not, but it's going to get better. Cerebrospinal fluid itself is colorless. It is, so that means clear, at least it's supposed to be. There shouldn't be proteins in it that are of any size. There shouldn't be blood in it, white blood cells. There shouldn't be pathogens in it. It should be basically water, sugar, dissolved oxygen, and just very small, tiny proteins at the most, sodium. It is truly a bit of a shock absorber, but it is making sure that oxygen and water and sugar gets to neurons. Removes waste during sleep. All right, I'll go with that. And it completely bathes the brain and spinal cord. Now that you know the meninges and cerebral spinal fluid, let me introduce you to the brain. The brain. I think it's safe to say that your most vital structure, your most delicate structure, the most important organ you have is your brain. It is everything you are as far as your personality, your behavior, your mood, your expressions, your ideas, your concrete thoughts, abstract thoughts, your execution of movement, your awareness of your environment. It is your brain. And unlike any other part of the body, if you were to have it, say, removed, or if you will, a donor brain, would you be you? In other words, if I had a brain transplant, would I still be me? If I have a heart transplant, I'm still me. Might be somebody else's heart or an artificial heart or a lung transplant or a liver transplant or a kidney transplant. I mean, even if I had a whole hand transplant, somebody else's hand, I'd still be me, right? I'd have some donor hand that got sewn on. And I only mention that because about 15 years ago, I came across a article about the first human hand transplant. And the reason why the article struck me is not because they transplanted the hand, but because after the surgery was done, they lost track of the person, so they weren't able to figure out how successful the hand transplant was. I just thought that was very ironic. What's the difference of the mind and the brain? Well, that's a question that can open up a very big debate. The difference of the mind and the brain. So I think it's fair to say that the brain is the way of talking about the physical structure, and the mind is putting parts of the brain together that formulate, if you will, the essence of your thought and your decision making and things like that. So I think that you can use it synonymously where you say brain and mind, but if you're talking about the actual organ of this and its parts, it's brain. You wouldn't call it the mind. But when you get into the discussion of one's thought processes and one's decision making and one's analyzing, and then you can get into the mind component of the brain, if you want to say it like that. But it is open for debate as far as how loosely you use mind or brain. So the brain, anatomically speaking, is, well, an incredibly delicate, vital part of who you are. I go back to that original question. If you were to transplant your brain, would you be you? And I would venture to say that a brain transplant, which has never been done, you're not going to be you. You might look like you might have your body, but you're not going to have all that comes along with the brain and its functionality. If all your brain did was control and coordinate your other body systems, well, maybe arguably a brain transplant, you would still be you. But all of your memories, all of your mood, all of your behavior, all of your personality, all of your intellectual thought processes, your ability to plan and execute movement, your ability to process the stimulations of the environment, and respond to them. It's all inside your brain. And just change a little bit of that, and it can severely impact the way a person lives. So there's a very, very famous case where even the skull of this individual is in the Smithsonian Institute. The cases of a railroad worker named Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage was in his early 20s. As far as I know, married, probably had a couple kids. And Phineas Gage is famous because he survived an injury that damaged his brain. What happened is he was using a tamping rod, and these are long, thin, 7 to 9 foot rods that when you put dynamite into a hole, you then tamp it down to get it into the rock bed, the bedrock, yes, the bedrock, because they were using dynamite to break up rock to lay down railroad. And as he puts the dynamite into this relatively small hole and he takes his tamping rod and he starts tamping the dynamite down, it caused a premature explosion of the dynamite. Okay, I don't know if it sparked or what, but as he went to tamp down, it exploded and the tamping rod went up. It went through his left cheek, took out his eye, and came out the front of his skull. Knocked him back. He gets up. People take him to the local doctor. The doctor doesn't believe that he just had a spike, this rod go through his brain, until he examines him and sees pieces of brain tissue sitting on his skull. Not only did Phineas Gage survive that injury to his brain, but his recovery was journaled, recorded, and he survived the physical side of the injury, but his mood, his behavior, his personality was drastically different following the injury. He became, according to articles anyway, loud and abusive, obnoxious. In other words, you can think something and not say it because you know there's consequence. If he thought it, he said it. It didn't matter. He seemed to be a little bit more abrupt and outright as far as foul language and angry. And even though there's a lot of different rumors as far as what happened to him over the next 10 years, from died in a bar fight to, severely depressed or whatever. Most of those stories just aren't true. He ended up moving back to the East Coast somewhere. He lived another roughly 10 to 12 years and died in his early 40s of something that wasn't even related to the brain injury. So the reason why it got so much attention was because it really sparked a debate between nature and nurture as far as the brain went, because it was believed that how you were raised and how you were mannered had, it was all in, parenting and schooling and things of that sort. And this is really the first journaled discussion of how much he had changed from the person he was prior to his injury to the person he became after his injury, as far as no longer being mild-mannered, no longer being able to control his emotions as far as emotional outbursts, no longer able to, stay silent to where he would just outright interrupt and be rude with, again, swear words and just a complete change of personality. And it turns out that the reason why that happened was because the injury to the brain wasn't to the vital part of his brain that was important for keeping him alive. The brain that he lost was brain that was responsible for his mood, his behavior, and his personality. A part of his brain that developed over the 20 some odd years prior to the injury, where he was able to use that part of his brain to to basically to deal with his mood, or to to appreciate any change to mood. And because we all have mood changes, we're all happy at times and sad at times, and this and that. And some people deal with more issues as far as severe depression or anxiety, and those are areas of the front of the brain that are really responsible for those types of behaviors and those responses. And when you have a brain that develops over 20-25 years, and then you lose a big part of it, the rest of the brain has to compensate for it. And though the rest of his brain was still processing his environment and still analyzing his day, when it was time for the front of his brain to then engage and do those things, it wasn't there. And again, the brain doesn't regenerate. It doesn't regrow new brain cells where there was a loss of that original brain from the injury. So he couldn't really control his mood in the manner at which he had prior to his injury. He couldn't justify his behavior to all of the learned behaviors that he had developed over the 20 some odd years prior to the injury. It was gone. So fast forward to more modern times, where when people do have severe personality disorders, clinical depression, anxiety, aggressive behavior, things like that, one of the approaches in science is, well, let's go ahead and remove some of the frontal lobes of the brain and see if that can alter those behaviors and those personalities and those moods to where it's not leading a person toward an inability to be a part of society. So you may have heard of things called frontal lobotomies, where pieces of the frontal lobes of the brain have been removed. The old school way was to actually go in and cut stuff out. More modern ways of doing it is using electrical current to slowly kill off part of the frontal lobes. But this is all in an effort to change a person's mood or their behavior or their personality to where they're no longer dealing with the severities of whatever's complicating those things. So more recently, I was watching a PBS show. I actually found myself intrigued by it. It was a story of sub postmasters over in England who, had always, since the 1600s, when the post office in England was around, the post office would subcontract out to where shop owners would have these little small post offices. And the shop owners would basically keep hand records of their monies in and monies out, and then they pay postage to the mail, the post office, as far as the country's post office. And in the 1990s, the post office switched to a computerized accounting system, and all these sub postmasters, not all of them, but many of them, were having issues making their numbers meet. And they would call the post office to try to get help. And the post office kept telling these individuals that they're the only ones having this problem. You owe this money. And the post office would either take them to court or put them in jail if they couldn't pay. And some of them ended up with thousands upon thousands. I'm not just talking a few thousand. Some of them were in the range of $50,000, $60,000, however many pounds owed to the post office. And it was money that these sub postmasters couldn't account for, because their computerized accounting system was saying that they owed more money than they were actually making. So eventually, along England, they start, some of the sub postmasters contact other postmasters, and they find out that this is actually a bigger problem. And it takes more than 20 years, but they finally get it to a court system where even before Parliament, where they were able to prove that there was some internal problem that the post office wasn't addressing. And even though there were only 555 plaintiffs against the post office, there were over 2,600 people in England that were having this problem. And it became a real nightmare. Well, the reason I bring it up is because one of the sub postmasters was a it was a family shop of British citizens of Indian background, and the community that they lived in was mostly ethnic Indian. And when the post office went after her for money, they threw her in jail. It put this stigma on her, and she knew she didn't steal the money, but everybody in the community was now calling her a thief and a crook and this and that. And she got so depressed, she couldn't go out in public, she couldn't eat. And in the show, and not only in the, because PBS did an actor's version, and then they followed it up with a real documentary of it. But the lady, she's in her 40s, and she's so severely depressed that her husband doesn't know what to do. So they go to a psychiatrist, and they do this frontal lobotomy. They did 14 procedures to try to essentially decrease the amount of brain that was dealing with that mood and that personality of, if you will, the anxiety of what she was going through. The depression was so great, and she was at least fortunate to survive. You can tell she's her mood is very subdued. But there were four other people that actually committed suicide because they were accused of these crimes that they didn't commit. They're in small little towns, and when you have that label of thief, the people sometimes aren't very, very willing to accept that, innocent until proven guilty. And some of these people, they were almost forced to take guilty pleas because of the pressure that was put on them by their community and by the post office. If you watch it, it's at least it got me angry with the post office, not ours, but England. But I really felt for this young woman who, had suffered such a massive amount of depression due to the angst and just all of the bad press. I mean, she was in the paper. There were posters. People were throwing things at their shop. They really, when she was first accused of this, they really went after her, and she just never got over that depression until having had these frontal lobotomies. And I didn't even think that in 2020, because that was around 2017, 2018 or so when she had them. And by the time they interviewed her in 2021, I didn't know that those were still procedures that were that commonly used. But I guess it was because all other means of helping her with her depression failed. This was the importance of the front part of her brain. Now, let's say that tamping rod that Phineas Gage was injured by, let's say that it just went a few inches backward, and it would have gotten a more basic part of the brain called the brainstem. He'd have been dead on sight. He would not have survived. He would have never got up. He would have been dead. Okay. How did he die? A tamping rod went through his face and took out his brainstem, not surviving that. Now, again, he could have had enough bleeding or infection or any other number of things that could have still killed him from his injuries. He was just fortunate enough to have gone straight to a doctor who was able to keep infection and bleeding at minimum to where he survived. If the tamping rod would have gone through the backside of his brain instead of the front side of his brain, there may not have been anything that ever affected his personality, but he may have lost the ability, if he survived, that is, he may have lost, sensation. He may have had the whole side of his body like having had a stroke, and he ends up with contractures and an inability to move or an inability to talk. Or maybe if it's just the very back of the skull, to never really see again, and that's pretty rare to find that kind of brain injury to only the back of the skull. From that, most of the backside of the skull is blunt force coming through the skull, like a bat or something else, or something that straight lines with the skull rather than shooting upward. Point being is that for Phineas Gage, his specific notable changes were the result of losing parts of the brain that were responsible for those types of things. Again, his behavior, his mood, his personality, that's all located in the region of the brain in which he lost. If a person has a stroke, and whether it's a hemorrhagic stroke, which means that there's a bleed and blood's not getting into the neurons because it's bleeding in a free open space, or whether it's ischemic, which means that something's blocking blood flow to the brain and brain tissue dies. Brain tissue dies, that's a stroke. Signs and symptoms of that stroke are always relative to what parts of the brain that are dying. If it's the back part of the brain dying, it's sensory loss. If it's the front side of the brain dying, or at least the top side, it's motor loss. And as you get far to the front, it's behavioral mood changes. I cannot tell you the number of stories from people that have had strokes where the first thing that is said by family members or friends is, wow, they are totally different as like, for example, they used to be the nicest person. Now they're the angriest person, or the other way around. They used to be just angry. And now they're the sweetest person you ever met. There was a story that I had come across probably in the mid 2000s where over in England, 30 something, he was in his later 30s. He was, for whatever reason, at a park on top of a hill, and people were climbing into these big tires and rolling down the hill with the tires. So he climbs in and he goes down the hill, and it jars him, and he ends up with these shearing injuries that cause him to have a stroke. And when he woke up in recovery or whatever, again, he was a family man, married, kids. Now he's just flamboyantly gay, outright homosexual. So either he had always suppressed it, or something affected his personality to where he decided that he is going to embrace this new person who is very different, homosexual rather than heterosexual. I even came across a story where somebody who had had a stroke in Kansas, for example, when they recovered, could only speak with an Irish accent. And I don't know how that happens or why that happens. I cannot explain it. I'm just telling you the things that I've come across, all because of these stroke or brain injury type stories of recovery, and how people are observably different prior to those injuries or those strokes rather than how they were, the pre to the post as far as the changes therein. So I'm sure there's a lot of good ones out there. The brain is very, very remarkable. It's an incredible supercomputer. In our growing years, it's very, very hungry to learn. The amount of synapses that it develops and prunes and shapes and all the room it makes for more learning, it's astronomical, really. And just some very, very impressive stories that sometimes I show video of. Sometimes I just talk about it. One of the kids, I haven't shown the video in a while, but I mention it because it's a testament to how hungry the young brain can be. 2-year-old kid, somewhere between 2 and 3, has to have surgery. Let me read the chat first here, and then I'll tell you the story. How does a concussion, and yes, it is spelled correctly, become fatal? Concussion falls into the category of what's called CTE, cerebral. So the C is chronic, T is traumatic encephalopathies, or concussive. Yeah, so chronic traumatic encephalopathies, which are basically brain injuries. Okay. There are different levels of brain injury. If you want to keep it simple, there's brain injury without bleeding, there's brain injury with bleeding, and then there's brain injury with tissue death. The lesser, if you will, if you want to say it this way, the lesser the amount of trauma, the more likely you are just in the concussive category. If there's enough trauma to incur bleeding, then you've got contusion, And if there's enough that causes actual brain damage, tissue death, then you've got more of a severe encephalopathy, a brain pathology. Concussion probably should be graded to where you have mild forms of concussions and severe concussions. The more severe the concussion, the more severe the impact with the skull and the force that goes through the brain, causing shearing injury to vessels, causing damage to the brain. It can be enough concussive force that one-time concussion can be fatal. I want you to think of like an explosion, a grenade exploding. When a grenade explodes, yes, there are people that are hit with some shrapnel, but if you're close enough to a device like that, when it explodes, the amount of force that goes through the body is concussive, and it will cause blood vessels in the brain to burst from that force. So people don't survive the concussive nature of that force going through the body. If you were to slow down concussion, when the head strikes an object, the skull hits first, and then the brain essentially bounces off the skull, and all that force goes through the brain, and there could be some degree of injury, again, depending on how much force and counterforce goes through the brain. If it's enough that there's a bleed, that's significant. If there's enough to where there's tissue damage, that's even more significant. And again, depending on where the concussion is, could cause someone to die. If there's enough concussive force to the brainstem or spinal cord, the person often dies from it. That type of concussive force often incurs injuries elsewhere in the body, not just the skull. And so, it's probably a lose-lose battle. If you survive the head injury part of it, the concussive forces of the rest of the body, the internal bleeding may lead to a person's demise. When a person has concussion after concussion after concussion, that's where it gets scary, because even though it's not very well understood, it's almost as if the brain can't tolerate that continuity of injury to itself, and that's where it leads to potential fatality, where what was a minor traumatic force to the brain was received as a major concussive force because of the repetition of injuries that the person had. So there are a number of research teams that are still doing studies with concussion, trying to determine the long-term physical effects of concussion. We certainly know that people have had more severe concussions, especially repetitive concussions, that over time there are changes to their behavior and their mood. Some famous athletes, for example, as they retired and got later in life, dealing with the aging of the brain and with having had so many concussions, they struggle to keep jobs. They struggle to have interpersonal relationships with spouses. They often divorce, become secluded and loners. One of the famous NFL football players that was concussive, linebacker named Junior Seau, when he committed suicide, he purposely, he had written, he wanted science to study his brain, and he made sure that he was leaving his brain intact when he committed suicide. He was very clear in his suicide note that he really believed that all of his concussions had caused him to become the person he had, and he wanted science to study his brain. So the answer to the question is, we don't typically expect a concussion to be fatal, but if there's enough concussive force and it affects the more vital parts of the brain, it can kill someone. Or if there's, again, that repetition where a person has had concussion after concussion after concussion, the lesser amounts of concussive force can indeed be fatal. So that's what we know thus far. There's a lot of research on CTE right now, on that chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and I do believe that most organizations are taking the right they're taking the right actions to try to minimize, to work to minimize people being susceptible to concussion. In the world of athletics, soccer included, many of the coaches in the United States, when they now have to be licensed to coach at certain levels, And part of that licensure is they're required to take classes on concussion, recognizing concussion, how to respond to concussion. And this is all in an effort to make sure that coaches recognize when their athletes have potentially had a head injury, and that way, you're not putting them at greater risk because you keep them in the game and there's another potential chance of a head injury. So I know for sure in football, in soccer, those sports especially, those coaches have to have a class on it. Not much different than nowadays, where you see for a lot of professionals who license, because there had been so much sexual harassment and things like that, that now as part of licensure, many professionals have to take a small sexual harassment type course. In the world of sports, a lot of coaches have to take a small concussion awareness course, and I think it's important, and I think that's a good step, because even me as a person, I've had my head traumas, my concussions, and I'm not the first one to go, okay, I just had a concussion, I better sit down. I'm right back to it, whether it was a concussion on my bicycle or a concussion playing sports. When I was 12, I had a concussion, put me in the hospital for 2 days. Is it possible that the next concussion kills me? I sure hope not, but absolutely it's possible. So some would say, well, why do you take those risks? And for me, it's like most things in life. It's like I'd rather not fear living life in fear of that is going to happen. I would just work to avoid it at all, if all possible, and still enjoy what little life of left I have. Let's say that properly. What little life left I have. Yes. All right. And hopefully it's not a little life. Hopefully it's a lot of life. But yeah, those are good questions as far as concussion. So the story that I was going to tell you was of a 2-year-old who wasn't even 3 yet, who had optic nerve cancer. And so at the age of before 3, he had his eyes and optic nerves removed. So he grows up to be a teenager. He learns how to do echolocation, clicking. And he is incredibly astute at hearing the echo of return of clicking. So we see him, we get to meet him as a 15-year-old who's being interviewed by a reporter. And this young teenager, again, he has no eyes, but he can ride his bicycle on the street. He can play video games, foosball. At least he's doing all these in the interview. And at one point, he's walking with the reporter. The reporter's producer or whoever had put a trash can, laid it down on the sidewalk, and as they're walking up to it, hold on, something's in the sidewalk. I think a trash can fell over. And they walk around it. He's like, how did you do that? How did you know that was there? And he said, I can hear it. So the question is how can he hear so well as a 15-year-old? And my argument is this: for almost 3 years, his brain was growing and developing, and his eyes were giving his brain information. And then in an instant, his eyes could no longer give the back part of his brain the information that the back part of his brain wanted so badly. So as he continued to grow from 4 to 5 to 6, every year, that part of his brain was hungry to learn. And though sound is coming into more of the side of the brain, it seems logical that his brain was relaying information so that the back of his brain was basically enhancing what he was getting as far as sound. And his ability to distinguish sound was so great relative to, say, yours or mine, because our brains got visual input and that part didn't really work correct in close connection with the hearing part. That now you've got this essentially a superhuman of a kid who can basically hear his world rather than see it, and to be able to have the confidence to run up and down steps because he can hear the spatial difference, and to ride his bike not concerned about crashing into objects. And I'm sure he's fallen many times. I'm sure he's crashing into things many times by walking, running, jumping, riding his bike. Even with eyesight, I've done that. But my point being is that he probably can't hear it all. But either way, his parents wouldn't let him use his blindness as a handicap, and his developing brain was so hungry to learn when all that information was coming in, and in an instant it wasn't. Now, let's say that I were to have my eyes removed right now. My brain would not have that capacity to grow and develop and learn like his did. I could teach myself to some degree some echolocation, and I'd probably be pretty good if I was coming up to a wall, but I don't think I could ride a bicycle with confidence. I don't think that I could recognize a fallen trash can in the sidewalk, but who knows? There's a team of neurologists, neuroscientists that was working to train people on echolocation, and they found that those that started it at a very young age were more astute at doing echolocation by clicking than somebody who in their 30s or 40s starts learning that. And again, that's a testament to parts of the brain working with each other. And for the kid that lost his eyes, just that hungry brain, that part of his brain that he was using for visual interpretation that was ready to grow and go. And I really think that to some degree he was fortunate to have those few years where he could see in order to really encourage his brain to do that. I've had students that have been blind their whole life, and I don't know if the visual part of their brain has ever, just picked up the responsibility of sound or taste or touch to where they've got enhanced senses. But it seems logical if you have to rely on what you smell and what you hear and what you taste and what you feel so much more than what you see because you can't see. And one of my former students, getting close to his later 50s now. He never had the sense of sight. Incredibly intelligent person. I have no idea what he does in his brain as far as his mind, as far as if you talk about colors or if you talk about certain shapes. He can feel certain shapes, but can he see that three-dimensionally? I don't know. You talk about the difference between red, blue, yellow, green, whatever, and in his mind, he has to create what it means to be red or blue or green because he's never seen those colors. And whether or not his brain sees those colors and he has to, however, he has to rationalize what that is, I don't know. But what a amazing thing this brain is, and how it adapts when it doesn't really have everything it needs, like sound for the person who's deaf or sight for the person who's blind. All right. So the story of the brain starts very early on. Okay. The story of the brain starts in utero, in the womb, where the nervous system develops in an embryo through a fold in embryological tissue that is referred to as, eventually becomes known as the notochord, and then the brain and spinal cord develop from it. What we end up seeing is that there is an embryological discussion of the brain and its parts, and a lot of that fits this word right here, diencephalon. In fact, when you talk about the different parts of the central nervous system, you hear telencephalon, mesencephalon, metaencephalon, myelencephalon, rhombencephalon, diencephalon, all these encephalons, okay? And all they really mean are parts inside the head, all right? So the first prefix, in this case, di means two. So the two parts inside the head, two parts inside the seps, inside the head. When you say myelin or myelencephalon, myel, M-Y-L-E, it's Greek for what the spinal cord is, which is why you hear a myelogram for a spinal cord study, why myelin is called myelin. Myelin's actually wrongly called myelin, by the way, because the first person that discovered it thought that it was like inside the cell when it was actually wrapped around the outside. So the myelencephalon, and I tell you what I'll do. I'll just show you those words and you'll see what I mean about the embryology of it. Okay, let me show you all those words. Let me get out of here. And I'm going to show you embryological development of the brain. Of sea turtle, okay. We'll just do brain. So you can see essentially what's happening as the brain develops, okay? Here it is after almost 30 days. 33 days. 52 days. Okay, that's development, okay? Everybody see the changing of the brain until they look like this guy. That's your adult versus your teenager versus your child, you know, at the time of birth, prior to birth, 16, 20 weeks of, you know, gestation, etc. So there's this development that's going on. Notice the way they've got this embryo at 4 weeks, at 5 weeks, and they've got these different parts. Okay. The purple part into the blue part is the whole of the nervous system. The purple part will eventually become the spinal cord. The green part and the red part will become the brainstem. And the blue part with this yellow part will become the very, very smart brain. And that's after only 5 weeks of gestation. That's 1 month. Okay, the size of a very small bean after a month. Once you get into that, you know, 5th week, now we're starting to see these little parts: telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, myelencephalon. And you don't ever need to know any of these. These are just, that's eventually become the smart brain. That's going to become the thalamus and hypothalamus. That's going to become the midbrain. That's going to become the brainstem. That's going to become the medulla oblongata and spinal cord. So that's the purple part. That's the green part. That's the lime part. That's the bluish part. And that's the yellow part if you come in here. The only part that seems to stay as far as word is diencephalon, because telencephalon is going to become cerebrum for the most part. Some people call it the forebrain. Yeah, you can see it right here. That forebrain is going to become the cerebrum. And then the mesencephalon is just this little zone right in here, okay, which is part of the brainstem called the pons and the cerebellum. The metaencephalon is beyond the spinal cord. It's right in here. It's the midbrain. Sorry, the midbrain is this orange thing right here. That's your metaencephalon. Rhombencephalon is what becomes the lower part here. And then you can see it right there. Rhombencephalon becomes the metencephalon. Myelencephalon is the purple part. None of those you have to know. I'm just showing you that they're words of embryology, okay? And all of this stuff eventually right there, look at that's all going to form the smart brain. That's how it looks after a month. And over time, that's going to become the largest part of your brain. This part right here, we continue to call the thalamus and hypothalamus, and it's what gives off that optic nerve, right? Which turns out to be part of the brain as it develops into its retina. And then the midbrain, the cerebellum and the pons, the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. So all things that we'll eventually get into. But before it's ever this far beyond, it's a prosencephalon, a mesencephalon, a rhombencephalon because of its rhombus shape. But it all started out as a cord, just a tube, the neural tube. And that happened, I want to say, day 7, 8, or 9 of the first part of the notochord starts to show. So the neural tube. It's been a while since I've done embryology, but it's amazing. It's mind-boggling. So the reason, and again, here's just some developing of the brain, all these pictures of brain developing. All we care about is once it's an adult brain, because that's where we get into the fun stuff. So when you look at your adult brain, you've got a cerebrum, a cerebellum, a brainstem, and capped on top of the brainstem, this thing called a diencephalon, which is your thalamus and hypothalamus. I like to talk about the brain in 3 parts. And this is how I'm going to do it for you. Let's get my little pen on here. Where's my pen? I'll just do it this way. Pointer options. Let me get my pen. For me, the cerebrum can be summarized by using 2-word phrase for what the cerebrum is. For me, the cerebrum is the smart brain. The smart brain. Anything that you're aware of, what you see, smell, hear, taste, feel, planning movement, your intellectual thought processes, cognitive thought processes, your calculation. If it's something that you can describe to somebody else that you were doing it, it's your smart brain. The cerebellum is what keeps you from falling down. So I like to say it's your balance brain. It uses fine motor control. It is responsible for fine motor control. But if you think about it, the ability to stay upright and balanced is due to fine motor control. So you have the smart brain and the cerebrum. You have the balanced brain and the cerebellum. The diencephalon and the brainstem together are basic. That is your basic brain. That is your primal brain. Some people call it, that is your amphibian brain. What does it mean? It means that if it's smart, you're aware of it. You are in the know. You know what's going on. It is intellectual. It is cognitive. Balance is all about adjusting posture, fine motor control. It's all about fine motor control. And your cerebellum is responsible for that. Fine motor skills. Just me being able to write this with my mouse requires some cerebellum. But my smart brain's the one saying do it. My cerebellum's making it to where it's fine motor. But the diencephalon with the brainstem, that's what's keeping me alive. It's making sure that my heart rate and rhythm speeds up or slows down as need be, that my breathing does what it needs to do, that my digestive activities, all of my reflexes, all the stuff. If it's keeping me alive, it's my brainstem. And you will find neurons in all of these. You will find astrocytes, microglia, ependymma, and oligodendrocytes in all of them as well. The brain is a magnificent thing. And it looks like this. This is the smart brain. You are seeing back here. You are feeling all through here. Smelling and tasting out to the side over there. I don't know why I'm writing it all like that. Let me get my eraser on here, get rid of some stuff. I want you to see smart. There you go. Okay, so all of that cerebrum is your smart brain. This is your balance brain, this blue thing, balance. And I don't mean homeostasis, like keeping your body internally balanced. I'm talking you don't fall down balanced. I'm talking I'm a little teapot balanced. I'm talking about the ability to stand on your tippy toes and touch the tip of your nose and do all of your movements so smoothly and coordinated that it's effortless. That is your cerebellum. But all of the rest, all of this, the purple thing called the diencephalon, the yellow, green, pink thing called the brain stem, all of that, again, I'll just section it. These three things, 1, 2, 3, those are your brainstem parts. Midbrain, number 1. Pons, number 2. Medulla oblongata, number 3, which just means the oblong or the oval or bulging marrow, the core, the pulp. That's what medulla oblongata means. And then there's the opening to the skull. Because once this has gone through the opening, it's now called spinal cord. If it's inside the skull, it's brain. If it's outside the skull, it's spinal cord. There is nothing that physically separates the brainstem from the spinal cord. They are a continuous piece of anatomy. However, we describe the spinal cord as outside the skull. We describe the brain stem, 1, 2, 3, as inside the skull. And what I like to do is cap this purple thing on top. The purple thing has 2 parts. It has a more egg-shaped thalamus and a more cube-shaped hypothalamus. The thalamus, if you remember from our discussion, if it wasn't last class, it was the class before, I said information that comes into the body gets sent up the backside of the spinal cord and it goes into the thalamus. The thalamus then knows where in the smart brain to send the information. Actually, I don't know why I just went forward. It better go to the top or to the back. Okay. And then the rest of the brain communicates forward. And then the forward brain continues down and out. Now, the hypothalamus, which is here, it regulates or monitors homeostasis. If you get too hot, it's what recognizes you're too hot. It institutes things that get you to cool off. If you're too cold, it'll heat you up. But it's not just a thermostat. It's also a hydrostat, a natriostat, which means for sodium, cholinostat, which is potassium. It monitors salt and sugar and hormones and immune levels. I mean, it's responsible for monitoring anything in that realm of homeostasis. The hypothalamus simply recognizes that there's a lack of homeostasis, and it will then encourage things either by sending information to the pituitary gland, sending information into the directionally in toward the midbrain or the lower thalamus, right? And then changes can institute to the smart brain. Let's try it like this. Let me erase the ink. If you do the thalamus, hypothalamus, midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata as one thing. I don't know if you see the shape of it, but you see how it kind of looks like a seahorse? There's actually a part of the brain, not this whole thing, but an even smaller part of the brain right in here that looks like a seahorse. And it's called the seahorse. in Latin, which is hippocampus. Campus is ocean or sea, and hippo means horse. If you did not know that hippo meant horse, I want you to look up the translation of hippopotamus, which is river horse. All right. So when we talk about this part of the brain, the big part of the brain, it's all things we would deem smart, intelligent, intellectual, cognitive. When we talk about this part, little brain, which is what cerebellum translates to, little brain, it's all about fine motor control and balance. But when we talk about the rest, the part of the brain that doesn't even look like a brain, it looks more like a cane than it does a brain, then it's going to be everything basic and vital to your survival. Keeps you alive. Look, if your brain stem's working, but the brain isn't, the cerebrum isn't, as long as you're fed and clean and all that good stuff, you'll stay alive. But are you really living? That's a vegetative state. That's a comatose state. I mean, this will keep you breathing. This will keep your activities to where you need to, but you still need to have nutrition coming in. You still need to have oxygen coming in. So it'll keep breathing for you. As long as food is entering into your digestive system, it'll keep on digesting for you. But you're not aware of it. You're not cognitive of it. You're not responding to the environment. No. So the smart brain, as we talk about it, this is the area that was injured by Phineas Gage, not vital to survival. Should the injury have been more here, he would have lost the ability to move. He could want to move, but he wouldn't be able to move whatever parts that part of the brain are responsible for moving. If the injury would have been here, he would have lost sensation to that whole side of the body there. If the injury was here, he'd have visual issues. If it was down further, especially on the left side of the brain, he'd have comprehensive issues. And if it was even further to the front on the side, he could think it all he wants. He just won't be able to say it. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I had a patient back in the late 2000s who was in his 50s. He and his wife were driving from their O'Fallon home to St. Louis City to go do something. I don't remember exactly what they were doing. And they were on Interstate 64. And before they got to St. Louis, he started having numbness and issues in his right side. And like he felt like a headache that he'd never really had before. And so they decided to turn around and go back home, and never really made it home. He kind of passed out. So he pulled over and passed out, and his wife drove in the emergency room. He had a stroke. He's 6'5", 6'6", basketball player. And a few years later, he comes in to see me because massage therapist told him that I might be able to help him get some of the mobility back. And his main goal was he wanted to be able to play basketball again, but he had a little bit of what we call contractures in muscle. The stroke happened because a blood clot developed on one of his heart valves, and it broke free and it shot up into his brain, and it lodged into a blood vessel on the left side of his brain, affecting his motor areas and his speech area. Not his comprehension, not his ability to receive information, but his ability to then turn around and make muscles work the way he wanted to. So because muscle control was lost, some of the muscles had developed what are called contractures. They go into a permanent state of contraction. And so he couldn't fully straighten his elbow, he couldn't fully straighten his knee, and he really couldn't fully straighten his fingers, okay? When he would talk to me, he would start to speak where he knew what he wanted to say, but he'd have trouble, and he finally just get frustrated with it, and then he'd grab his phone and he would just type it into his phone. He knew what he wanted to say, but his ability to actually say it was interrupted because that's where he had injured his brain from the stroke. And once he recognized that he wasn't going to be able to say it the way he wanted to say it, he would just type it into his phone. He could write it, he could think it, he could type it, he just couldn't say it because of the part of his brain that was injured by the stroke. Had that been further back on his brain, he might not even be able to comprehend what he wants to say. And so he may have no problem speaking. It's just going to come out as garbled mumbo jumbo. It won't make any sense. For him, it was this stutter or this inability to finish a word or a sentence, or because he would just get to a point where he could not say it. And again, he's aware of the fact that he couldn't say it. The part of his brain that he allowed him to understand what he was hearing and seeing, that wasn't affected, but it was more of the front part of the left hemisphere where we have an area of the brain that we use for speech called Wernicke. No, Wernicke is comprehension. It's called it's on the tip of my tongue. Oh, that just drives me nuts when I can't hear it. It's right here. The green thing right here. Broca's area. Broca's area. Okay. So let me show you where his stroke was. I'm going to zoom in so you can see it better. Okay. So his stroke affected this part of his brain right here, including Broca's area. So this green is where you plan your execution and all these muscle movements and speech patterns. And then here to the front, that is awareness, personality, mood, behavior. Here to the back is vision. Here is comprehension, language. Here is hearing it. Here is tasting it, right? So very important parts of the cerebrum as far as the smart brain goes. The frontal lobe's named because it sits behind the frontal bones. The parietal lobe is named because it sits underneath the parietal bones. The temporal lobe is named because it sits in front or behind, if you will, the temporal bone. The occipital lobe is, they're named for the bones they sit behind. There's the occipital bone in the back and the parietal bone on top and the frontal bone in the front. Okay, these are the bones of the skull. The lobes are just named with the bones. There isn't, if you were to open it up, there is an insulated lobe in there called the insula or the Isle of Ryle. That's never going to come back to haunt you, but it just happens to be an extra lobe, a fifth lobe, if you will. But when you break the lobes down, you've got motor from the front. You've got the ability. Remember earlier or a few days ago, I said that you would be feeling your finger, or your hand on the top part. So when you look at it, you have what's called a homunculus, the shape of a man, and it's very disproportionate because there's so many more nerve endings in your hands and your feet and your lips than there are in the whole rest of your arm, that it is this tiny little part for your brain for your arm and a massive amount of the gyrus for your hands and your fingers. Say anywhere where you touch the world, your feet, your lips, your tongue, genitalia, your hands and fingers, there's more brain because there's more nerve endings there. Areas where you don't typically touch the world, the backs of your arms, your back, your buttock. I mean, we sit a lot, but you don't have as many nerve endings in your rear end as you do in the soles of your feet. So we're very disproportionate like that. But when you look at the way homunculus is mapped across this gyrus, there's a whole lot of brain for your hands, but only a little bit for the rest of your body. Your hands are right in here and your body's right there. And as you get down in the genitalia and things of that sort. But then when you go to move, there's so many more muscles in your hands than there are the whole of your extremity, that there's a lot more. And that's why we're very fine motor skilled with our hands, because this part of your brain says do it. And as it sends the signal, it gets picked up by the cerebellum that says this is how we're to fine tune it. And by the time the signal gets to your muscles, it's so effortless that you easily do the things you want with your muscles and your hands especially. And boy, your eyes, the muscles that move your eyes work so efficiently. And a big part of that is you see it, and there's that intercommunication with what you want. Your brain says, I want it to go here. And there's all this area just for vision. You see it here, but then you move your eyes and you position and you focus and all that, and it comes together so that the image is always coming in clear on the occiput. As long as the occipital lobe is getting clear imagery, it'll allow your eyes to do what they do, your lens to focus, your eyes to move near, far, whatnot. It's again effortless. And the cerebellum is a big part of that because it takes over all that fine motor control that the smart brain decides it wants to do. Very, very impressive smart brain that we have. So these are the cerebrum. So let's do a quick summary of the parts, okay? The cerebrum, the smart brain. It is the largest part of the brain. That's true. It is the highest in its position. That is also true. The outer part, called the gray matter, is the cortex. The inner part is the tracts of white matter, which are myelinated. Remember, you've got the creases. So take a look at my hand here, okay? I'm going to try to do it like, I'm going to see if I can, let me get this here so I can see my own hand. All right. So if my hand was like the brain, each part of my finger would be a gyrus, and each crease would be a sulcus. Okay. And that's what an Alzheimer's brain looks like. Really thin gyri, huge chasms of sulcus, but a healthy brain, the gyri are real close and the sulci are real tight. It actually looks like, with an Alzheimer's brain, like the gyrus deflates, and that's what allows the sulcus to become so wide. The left part of the brain, called the left hemisphere, and the right part of the brain, the right hemisphere, they are capped on top of what's called, you ready? In English, the hard body. Corpus means body, callosum or callus means hard, the hard body. Because unlike the rest of the brain that is soft and relatively gelatinous in its texture, the hard body is a firm cap. But it is the bridge between the left and right hemispheres. The left hemisphere is responsible for the whole of the right side of the body. The right hemisphere is responsible for the whole of the left side of the body. And most neurologists would agree that the left hemisphere typically is more analytical, mathematical, sound reasoning. As far as receptive, expressive, that means it receives very well. As far as information flow coming in, very quick to express outward. Whereas the right side is more of your artistic, creative side, your musical side, your ability to, have, spatial range, like feng shui, for example. Whether or not it's more involved in emotion is up for debate. Whether or not everybody is truly left-brained or right-brained is up for debate. We do believe that there are a number of people that are actually mirrored, where even though they are left-handed, they demonstrate from their right hemisphere what a typical left hemisphere person would. So there is this discussion, are you left-brained or right-brained? And it's all based upon whether or not you have a tendency to gravitate toward what you see here as far as language skills and analytical skills versus artistic, creative. But again, it's very conceivable that somebody could easily be left-handed, but the right side of their brain developed as it would or should have left, and vice versa. When I was in high school, I was a bass player in the jazz band, and our drummer, he wore a metal alert bracelet because he had what's called organus inversus. And he had a very rare form of it where every organ in his body was on the other side from where it should have been. So he was a complete mirror image. So it wouldn't surprise me one bit if his brain was exactly what I'm talking about. All right. So when I see you again on Thursday, we are going to pick up with this brain discussion, and I will definitely talk a little bit more about the cerebrum and the cerebellum and the brain stem, as well as the spinal cord. Does that sound like a plan? I hope it does, because that's what's on slate for Thursday. So I'm going to stop the share. Feel free to look at for this recording here in about I got to go teach a class tonight. So I will get it done on my first break, and I will send all the information I have to you for tonight's stuff. And Ina says she will send the notes too. You got it. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. See you Thursday, 6 p.m. Bye.